Here's the thing about war. It has this delightful habit of turning paradise into a burning hellscape faster than you can say tactical miscalculation. Take Kepler 442b, for instance, a charming little rock where the sunsets are purple. The air tastes like copper, and apparently, everyone's trying to kill each other. The kind of place travel brochures would describe as rustic if they were written by psychopaths with a flair for understatement. The battlefield stretched before them like a particularly violent abstract painting, all scorched earth and twisted metal. Smoke curled lazily from the wreckage of what used to be a human supply depot, now reduced to the sort of modern art installation that screamed total tactical failure. The acrid smell of burned electronics and worse things hung in the air like an unwelcome dinner guest who refuses to leave. Corporal Danny Hammer Morrison lay sprawled behind the twisted remains of a transport vehicle, trying very hard not to bleed to death. His left shoulder felt like someone had taken a plasma torch to it, which, considering the Vakhar weapons technology, wasn't far from the truth. The good news? He was still breathing. The bad news? Everything else. "Well, this is going swimmingly," Danny muttered through gritted teeth, pressing his good hand against the wound that was doing its best impression of a very enthusiastic ketchup dispenser. His rifle lay somewhere in the debris field, probably keeping company with his dignity and any hope of a quick rescue. The thunderous approach of Vakhar boots made the ground vibrate like a bass drum at a death metal concert. Danny closed his eyes and tried to remember what his drill instructor had said about capture and interrogation. Something about name, rank, and serial number, followed by a lot of creative ways to tell your captors to go perform anatomically impossible acts upon themselves. The first Vakhar soldier to round the wreckage stood nearly 8 feet tall, all scales and muscle wrapped in battle armor that looked like it could stop a freight train. His reptilian head swiveled toward Danny with the kind of predatory focus that made every human instinct scream, "Play dead and hope it works." "Human warrior," the alien growled in surprisingly clear English, his voice like gravel in a cement mixer. "You fight well for dying meat." "Thanks," Danny wheezed, managing what he hoped was a defiant grin, despite the fact that his face probably looked like he'd gone 10 rounds with a blender. "I'll be sure to put that on my resume under customer testimonials." More Vakhar soldiers emerged from the smoke, their weapons trained on him with the sort of professional attention that suggested they really, really wanted an excuse to turn him into component atoms. Their leader, distinguished by the extra spikes on his armor and what Danny assumed was either a rank insignia or a particularly aggressive fashion statement, studied the human with yellow eyes that held all the warmth of a tax audit. "Secure the prisoner," the leader commanded. "General Thekmore will want to question this one personally." Oh, wonderful. Danny had heard of General Thekmore. Everyone in the Terran Marine Corps had heard of General Thekmore. The kind of bedtime story that ended with entire human colonies going mysteriously quiet and orbital bombardments that turned cities into glass parking lots. The Vakhar Empire's poster child for reasons why humans should have stayed home and taken up gardening instead. Strong hands hauled Danny to his feet, and he bit back a scream that would have shattered what remained of his dignity. The world tilted sideways, then decided to do a few experimental barrel rolls just to see how much abuse his inner ear could take before filing a formal complaint. "Easy there, Corporal Wobbly Legs," one of the soldiers said, in that universal tone of someone who'd seen too many prisoners try to faceplant into the dirt. "Save some drama for the interrogation." The Vakhar transport ship loomed overhead like a mechanical thundercloud, all sharp angles and gun turrets that suggested its designers had confused intimidating military vessel with flying death wish. The boarding ramp lowered with a hydraulic hiss that sounded remarkably like a giant snake with asthma. As they dragged him aboard, Danny caught glimpses of the ship's interior, corridors wide enough to accommodate the Vakhar's impressive bulk, lighting that favored the red end of the spectrum, and enough weapons lockers to outfit a small apocalypse. The air recycling system hummed with efficiency, carrying the sense of ozone and something that might have been industrial-strength disinfectant, or possibly what passed for Vakhar cologne. "Home, sweet home," Danny muttered, then immediately regretted speaking as the movement sent fresh waves of agony through his shoulder. The detention level proved to be every bit as welcoming as expected, which was to say, about as hospitable as a root canal performed by an angry badger. The cells were sized for Vakhar physiology, meaning Danny felt like he was being stored in a particularly roomy coffin. The force field hummed with the sort of ominous energy that promised very bad things would happen if he tried to test its structural integrity. A Vakhar medic, identifiable by the cross-shaped symbol on his armor, that probably meant healer in their culture, or possibly person who keeps prisoners alive long enough to be properly tortured, approached with a medical kit that looked suspiciously like a toolbox. "Try not to die before questioning," the medic said conversationally, applying some sort of biofoam to Danny's shoulder wound. The stuff stung like liquid fire mixed with disappointment, but it did seem to stop the bleeding. General becomes irritated when prisoners expire prematurely. "I'll do my best to disappoint him in person," Danny replied, though his voice came out as more of a croak than the defiant quip he'd been aiming for. The medic's laugh sounded like rocks tumbling down a mountain. Humans, always joking when facing death. His curious trait? "Yeah, well, it beats crying. Usually." As the medic finished his patch job and departed, Danny settled back against the cell's rear wall and tried to take inventory of his situation. Captured. Check. Wounded. Double check. Facing interrogation by one of the galaxy's most notorious military leaders. Triple check with a side order of, "Why did I ever leave Earth?" But here's the thing about humans that most alien species never quite manage to grasp. They had this annoying tendency to find hope in the most ridiculous circumstances. Even now, bleeding and captured deep in enemy territory, Danny's mind was already working on the problem. Marine training didn't include a chapter on how to escape from technologically advanced reptilian warships, but it did cover improvisation, adaptation, and the fine art of being too stubborn to die quietly. The ship's deck plates thrummed with the vibration of powerful engines, and through the small porthole in his cell, Danny could see stars wheeling slowly past as the vessel changed course. Somewhere in this flying fortress were weapons, communications equipment, and hopefully at least a few structural weaknesses that human ingenuity could exploit. "General Thekmore," Danny said to the empty cell, testing how the name felt in his mouth. "Well, sir, I hope you're ready for the most educational conversation of your considerably long and violent career." The stars continued their slow dance outside his window, indifferent to the small human drama playing out aboard the Vakhar warship. But if those stars had been capable of placing bets, the smart money wouldn't have been on the wounded Marine in the detention cell. It would have been on whatever unexpected variable was about to turn this whole situation completely upside down. After all, in a galaxy full of surprises, the biggest ones usually came in the smallest packages. 3 days of captivity had taught Danny several valuable life lessons. First, Vakhar prison food made military MREs look like five-star cuisine. Second, sleeping on metal deck plates did absolutely nothing for one's complexion or general sense of well-being. Third, infection had a charming way of turning minor plasma burns into the sort of fever dreams that made reality seem negotiable. The biofoam patch on his shoulder had done its job initially, but Danny's body had apparently decided to throw a full-scale revolt against alien medical technology. His temperature spiked and dropped like a roller coaster designed by a sadistic engineer, and the walls of his cell had developed this annoying habit of breathing when he wasn't looking directly at them. "Outstanding," Danny mumbled to his reflection in the polished metal surface of the cell door. The face staring back looked like it had been assembled from spare parts by someone working in the dark during an earthquake. "You're really knocking this whole prisoner of war thing out of the park, Marine." The ship's routine had become as predictable as a metronome. Guard shifts changed every 8 hours with military precision. Meal delivery, if the gray protein paste qualified as a meal, occurred at regular intervals. The soft hum of the ship's systems provided a constant white noise backdrop to Danny's increasingly creative, fever-induced hallucinations. But today, something was different. The first sign of trouble came when the lights flickered. Not the gentle dimming of a planned power cycle, but the sort of aggressive strobing that suggested someone, somewhere, was having a very bad day with the electrical systems. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing the detention level in an ominous red glow that made everything look like a scene from a particularly dramatic war movie. "Now that's interesting," Danny wheezed, pushing himself up against the wall. His shoulder protested with the sort of enthusiasm usually reserved for political rallies, but the pain helped cut through the fever fog clouding his thoughts. Somewhere in the distance, alarms began wailing. Not the sharp, immediate danger of battle stations, but the longer, more complex pattern that suggested internal systems failure. The kind of problem that made ship's engineers wake up in cold sweats and reach for the strongest available stimulants. Then, the detention bay's power grid hiccuped. The force field containing Danny's cell shimmered, flickered, and died with a sound like electronic disappointment. For exactly 3 seconds, nothing but a slight shimmer in the air stood between him and freedom. Then backup power kicked in, and the barrier snapped back to life with renewed vigor. But 3 seconds, as it turned out, was enough time for someone else entirely to take advantage of the malfunction. Danny first heard them before he saw them, soft footsteps padding down the corridor with the peculiar rhythm of someone trying very hard to be sneaky and failing spectacularly at it. The sound was too light for adult Vakhar, too irregular for maintenance drones, and altogether too curious for anything that belonged in a high-security detention facility. A small face appeared at the edge of his vision, peering around the corner with the sort of wide-eyed fascination that could only belong to a child. Danny blinked hard, wondering if his fever had finally succeeded in completely divorcing him from reality. The face belonged to a young Vakhar, but unlike the battle-scarred adults Danny had encountered, this one's scales still held the softer hues of youth. Curious golden eyes studied him with the sort of intense interest usually reserved for particularly fascinating zoo exhibits. "Oh, come on," Danny muttered. "First talking walls, now I'm hallucinating alien children. What's next? A chorus line of dancing medical equipment?" A second small face joined the first. This one slightly more cautious, but equally intrigued. The two young Vakhar whispered to each other in their native language, a conversation that sounded like wind chimes having an argument with a gravel truck. Danny rubbed his eyes with his good hand, expecting the hallucinations to dissolve back into the boring reality of prison walls and persistent infection. Instead, the two small figures stepped fully into view. They were definitely real, definitely young, and definitely not supposed to be wandering around unescorted in the detention level of a military vessel. The bolder of the two, a male, judging by the slightly more pronounced ridge along his skull, approached Danny's cell with the fearless curiosity that seemed to be a universal constant among children throughout the galaxy. His companion hung back, torn between fascination and the sort of caution that suggested at least one of them had functioning survival instincts. "Human," the bold one said in carefully pronounced English, his voice carrying the high pitch of youth despite the natural rasp of Vakhar vocal cords. "You are prisoner." "Outstanding deductive reasoning," Danny replied, then immediately felt bad for being sarcastic to what appeared to be a child. Fever or no fever, there were standards to maintain. "Yeah, kid, I'm a prisoner." "What gave it away? The cell or the general atmosphere of captivity?" The young Vakhar tilted his head with the sort of curiosity that would have been adorable if he hadn't been a member of a species currently trying to exterminate humanity. "You do not roar. Father says humans roar when caged." "Your father sounds like a smart guy," Danny said, settling back against the wall as another wave of fever-induced dizziness washed over him. "Tell me, what does he do for a living? Professional human cager? Interstellar tourism guide to scenic prison facilities?" The second young Vakhar, female, Danny realized, noting the slightly more delicate bone structure, stepped closer. "Father is general," she said, with obvious pride. "Commands ship, fights human warriors." Danny's fever-addled brain took a moment to process this information. Then it hit him like a plasma bolt to the frontal lobe. "Your father," he said slowly, "is General Thekmore." Both children nodded enthusiastically, apparently delighted that the strange human had figured out this elementary detail. "Fantastic," Danny breathed. "I'm being visited by the offspring of the galaxy's most notorious military commander. This fever dream just keeps getting better." The male cub, because what else could you call young Vakhar, studied Danny's pale, sweat-dampened face with growing concern. "You are damaged," he observed with the sort of clinical accuracy that suggested he'd been around military medical personnel his entire young life. "Just a little," Danny admitted. "Nothing a few weeks of proper medical attention and maybe a vacation somewhere tropical wouldn't fix." The female cub exchanged glances with her brother, then stepped even closer to the force field. "I am Nayla," she said formally. "Brother is Crix. We are twins of General Thekmore." "Pleased to meet you both," Danny replied, managing what he hoped was a reassuring smile, despite the fact that his face felt like it was melting. "I'm Corporal Danny Morrison, Terran Marine Corps. Your father and I haven't been formally introduced, but I'm sure we'll have a lovely chat soon." Crix, apparently the more adventurous of the twins, had been studying the cell's control panel with the sort of focused attention that made Danny deeply nervous. "Father's codes," the young Vakhar murmured, his small claws dancing over the interface. "Numbers and patterns. Watch often during briefings." "Oh no," Danny said, suddenly very awake despite his fever. "Kid, whatever you're thinking, that's probably not a great idea. Your father is not going to appreciate—" The force field died. Crix looked enormously pleased with himself, while Nala took several hasty steps backward with the sort of expression that suggested she was already composing explanations for their inevitable parental interrogation. "There," Crix announced proudly. "Now, human is not caged." Danny stared at the open cell door, then at the two young Vakhar who had just casually committed what was probably treason by 17 different military codes. His shoulder throbbed, his head spun, and somewhere in the distance, those system failure alarms continued their mechanical wailing. "You know what?" he said finally. "I think this fever might actually be an improvement over reality." But reality, as it turned out, had other plans entirely. Danny remained seated against the back wall of his now open cell, partly because standing seemed like an excellent way to redecorate the floor with whatever remained in his stomach, and partly because he had enough functioning brain cells left to recognize that two curious alien children were infinitely more dangerous to his long-term survival prospects than any force field. "Why do you not flee?" Nala asked, her head tilting in that universal gesture of childhood confusion that apparently transcended species barriers. "Door is open. Guards are distant. This is escape opportunity." "Well, sweetheart," Danny said, wiping sweat from his forehead with a shaking hand. "First, I can barely stand up without the world doing interpretive dance around me. Second, I'm on a ship in deep space, which makes the local real estate options somewhat limited. And third," he gestured weakly at the two young Vakhar, "I have a feeling that running off and leaving you two unsupervised would result in the sort of galactic incident that history books write strongly worded chapters about." Crix had wandered into the cell itself, studying Danny with the sort of fascination usually reserved for exotic zoo specimens. "You smell different," he announced, with the brutal honesty that seemed to be another universal constant among children. "Not like fear scent of other prisoners." "That's probably the infection talking," Danny replied, "though I appreciate the commentary on my personal hygiene. Really adds to the whole prisoner of war ambiance." The young male Vakhar circled him slowly, apparently cataloging every detail of human anatomy for future reference. "Father says humans are weak, small, break easily under pressure." "Your father's not wrong," Danny admitted, then caught sight of Nala hovering uncertainly in the doorway. "But he might be overlooking a few things, like our impressive capacity for poor decision-making and our tendency to do stupid things for stubborn reasons." "Stupid things?" Crix's golden eyes brightened with interest. "What manner of stupid things?" Danny couldn't help but laugh, despite the fact that laughing felt like someone was using his ribcage as a percussion instrument. "Oh, kid, where do I even start? We'll charge machine gun nests because someone told us not to. We'll explore haunted houses for fun. We'll eat food so spicy it causes physical pain, just to prove we can handle it." Both cubs exchanged glances, clearly trying to process this information. Nala stepped tentatively into the cell. "This sounds inefficient," she said carefully. "Completely inefficient," Danny agreed. "But here's the thing about inefficiency. Sometimes it leads to the most interesting outcomes, like right now, for instance. By all logical standards, I should either be trying to escape or cowering in the corner. Instead, I'm having a pleasant conversation with two young members of the species that's currently trying to wipe out humanity." Crix settled down cross-legged in front of Danny, apparently having decided that the wounded human represented no immediate threat. "Tell us about human cubs," he demanded, with the sort of imperial tone that suggested he was definitely his father's son. "Are they weak, like adults?" "Human children," Danny corrected gently, then paused as another wave of dizziness washed over him. "Well, they're physically smaller and weaker than adults, sure, but they're also curious, brave, and occasionally completely insane. Kind of like someone I could mention." He gestured weakly at Crix, who preened under what he apparently interpreted as a compliment. Nala had been studying Danny's wounded shoulder with growing concern. "You require medical attention," she observed. "Infection spreads. Without treatment, you will cease functioning." "That's a remarkably clinical way of saying, 'You're going to die,'" Danny said. But yeah, you're probably right. Your ship's medical bay wouldn't happen to offer treatment to enemy prisoners, would it? Healer Mordek follows protocols, Nala said seriously. Prisoners maintained at minimum viable health for interrogation purposes. Minimum viable health, Danny repeated. That's almost poetry. Dark, depressing poetry, but poetry nonetheless. Crix had been listening to this exchange with the sort of focused attention that suggested gears were turning behind those golden eyes. Father has private medical supplies, he said suddenly. For family emergencies, cubs are valuable resources. Crix, Nala hissed, recognizing the dangerous direction her brother's thoughts were taking. That would be helpful, Crix finished. Human shows no hostility, speaks of cubs with kindness. Perhaps reciprocal assistance is logical. Danny held up his good hand. Whoa there, kids. I appreciate the thought, but I'm pretty sure your father would consider unauthorized medical treatment of enemy prisoners to be the sort of thing that results in very serious conversations involving disappointment and probably punishment. Both cubs fell silent, and for a moment, Danny thought he'd successfully talked them out of whatever well-intentioned but catastrophically dangerous plan was forming in their young minds. Then Nala spoke up, her voice carrying a note of determination that sounded remarkably like her father's command presence. "Human Danny," she said formally, "you show kindness to cubs despite capture and pain. This is unexpected behavior." "Just returning the favor," Danny said softly. "You two are being kind to me, even though I'm supposed to be the enemy. Seems like the polite thing to do." The twins exchanged another look, and Danny had the sinking feeling that he'd just accidentally set some sort of cultural precedent that was going to make his already complicated situation infinitely more interesting. If there was one thing General Techmore prided himself on, it was maintaining absolute control over every aspect of his command. His fortress ship ran with the sort of mechanical precision that would make Swiss clockmakers weep with envy. Every system monitored, every crew member accounted for, every potential variable calculated and contained, which made the current situation particularly galling. "What do you mean, they're not in their quarters?" he growled at Guardian Hesara, his voice carrying the sort of menace that had caused entire enemy fleets to reconsider their life choices. The poor caretaker looked like she was mentally updating her last will and testament. "General, I performed the evening check as protocol demands," Hesara stammered, her scales shifting to the pale green that indicated extreme stress among her species. "The cubs were in their sleeping alcoves. I sealed the quarters according to security procedures. When I returned this morning for the wake cycle, they were absent." The general's massive frame seemed to expand as his battle-hardened instincts shifted into what his crew privately referred to as apocalypse mode. His yellow eyes blazed with the sort of intensity that could melt hull plating at 50 paces. "Sealed quarters do not simply open themselves," he said, with the deadly calm of a predator selecting its prey. "Explain to me, Guardian, how two cubs managed to defeat military-grade security systems designed to contain enemy combatants." "Sir, the power fluctuations from the sabotage attack may have compromised multiple systems," she offered weakly. "Engineering reports several security failures throughout the ship." "Ah, yes, the sabotage. Some particularly inventive human infiltrators had managed to plant explosive charges in the ship's secondary power grid, causing exactly the sort of cascading systems failure that turned well-ordered military operations into expensive fireworks displays. The damage was minimal, but the timing couldn't have been worse, or better, depending on one's perspective on the current crisis. "Commander Veltan, The general barked into his communication device. "Initiate ship-wide search protocol. Priority Alpha. The Cubs are missing." The response came back immediately, crisp and professional, despite the undertone of barely controlled panic. "Acknowledged, General. All available personnel deploying to search stations. Shall I activate the emergency beacon system?" "Negative. Internal search only. I will not have word of this security breach leaving the ship." The general's tactical mind was already analyzing possibilities, each one more unpalatable than the last. Cubs loose during a security alert, with enemy saboteurs potentially still aboard, systems failing throughout the ship. The variables were multiplying faster than his ability to control them. The search began with military efficiency that would have been impressive under any other circumstances. Squads of soldiers swept through every corridor, every maintenance shaft, every storage compartment large enough to hide a pair of curious young Vakhar. The ship's internal sensors painted a detailed picture of heat signatures, movement patterns, and life signs throughout the vessel, except in the detention level, where those same power fluctuations had temporarily blinded the monitoring systems. General Techmore personally led the search through the command decks, his presence causing junior officers to develop sudden interests in their console displays rather than risk making eye contact. The Cubs' biosignatures had vanished from tracking systems approximately 4 hours ago, roughly the same time as the power grid failure. "Sir," Lieutenant Brachtul reported via comlink, his voice tight with the sort of professional stress that came from being the bearer of increasingly bad news. "We've completed search of levels 1 through 15. No sign of the Cubs. Beginning sweep of engineering sections." The general's claws extended involuntarily, scoring deep gouges in the metal railing he'd been gripping. Crix and Nala had never vanished like this before. Even during their most ambitious adventures, they'd always left some trace, some trail of minor chaos that led directly to their hiding spots. This was different. This felt wrong. "Expand search to restricted areas," he commanded. "All security levels, every compartment, every access tunnel, every storage bay." "Sir?" Brachtul's voice carried a note of hesitation. "That includes the detention level." The general paused. The detention level currently housed exactly one prisoner, the human marine captured during the recent ground engagement. A wounded, fever-ridden enemy soldier who represented valuable intelligence but posed no immediate threat to ship security. Or so the preliminary reports had indicated. "The human prisoner," the general said slowly, his tactical mind already racing through possibilities. "Current status?" "Contained and stable, sir. Medical reports indicate infection, but no immediate risk of expiration. Scheduled for interrogation following your return from the strategy conference." The strategy conference. The general had spent the last 18 hours in meetings with the fleet command, planning the next phase of the campaign against human colonial forces. 18 hours during which his Cubs had been confined to quarters for their own safety, under the care of their guardian. 18 hours during which someone, or something, had caused his children to vanish without a trace. "Detention level," the general said, his voice carrying the sort of finality usually reserved for death sentences. "Search every cell, every storage compartment, every access point. If the human has harmed my Cubs—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Every member of his crew had seen what happened to enemies who threatened the general's family. The elevator ride to the detention level felt like it lasted approximately 3 geological ages. The general's mind churned through scenarios, each one more disturbing than the last. Human desperation could drive even wounded prisoners to attempt the unthinkable. If this Marine had somehow escaped his cell, if he had encountered the Cubs, if he had decided to use them as hostages or worse. The detention-level security station was manned by 2 guards who immediately snapped to attention when the general emerged from the elevator like an avenging force of nature. Their expressions shifted from routine alertness to barely controlled terror in the space of a single heartbeat. "Report," the general commanded. "Sir, all cells secure. Prisoner contained and monitored," the senior guard reported, with the sort of crisp efficiency that suggested he was hoping professionalism might somehow deflect whatever storm was clearly brewing. "No incidents, no unauthorized access, no." The general brushed past them without waiting for the full report. His enhanced hearing, evolved for tracking prey through dense vegetation, caught something the guards had missed. Soft breathing, multiple life signs, coming from the direction of the human's cell. He approached the detention area with the sort of predatory stealth that had made him legendary among both his own troops and enemy forces. His natural camouflage patterns shifted automatically, blending his massive frame into the shadows of the corridor. The force field was active. The cell appeared secure. But something was wrong with the picture. The general activated his personal scanner, reading biosignatures through the cell's containment systems. 3 life forms, 1 large, 2 small, all in close proximity. His cubs, alive, safe, and apparently sleeping on top of the human prisoner. For a moment, the general's tactical brain simply refused to process this information. It was like trying to calculate the square root of purple, or understanding the tactical implications of rainbow-colored plasma weaponry. The data existed, but it made no sense within any logical framework. He stepped closer to the cell's viewing portal and confirmed what his scanners had already told him. Crix and Nala lay curled against the human marine's chest, their small forms rising and falling with the rhythm of peaceful sleep. The human's good arm was wrapped protectively around them, while his wounded shoulder was cushioned by what appeared to be strips of fabric torn from his own uniform. The prisoner himself was clearly unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. Fever had flushed his pale skin, but his face held an expression of contentment that seemed completely at odds with his circumstances. The general stood frozen, staring at a scene that challenged every assumption he'd ever made about human nature, enemy behavior, and the basic principles of warfare. His cubs, his precious, irreplaceable cubs, had somehow found their way to the most dangerous individual on the ship. And instead of harm, they had found comfort? "Sir?" One of the guards had approached cautiously, recognizing that their commanding officer was experiencing some sort of system overload. "Shall we initiate extraction protocols?" The general's first instinct was to blast through the force field, eliminate the human threat, and secure his children immediately. His second instinct was to court-martial everyone involved in this security failure. His third instinct was to contact Fleet Command and request immediate transfer to a facility with better containment procedures. But a fourth instinct, one that had nothing to do with military training and everything to do with being a father, whispered something entirely different. The human could have used the cubs as hostages, could have threatened them to secure his escape, could have taken advantage of their innocence for any number of strategic purposes. Instead, he had wrapped them in makeshift blankets and held them while they slept. "Sir?" the guard prompted again, his voice carefully neutral. General Techmore stared at the impossible tableau before him and realized that 18 years of military service had prepared him for every possible scenario, except this one. How exactly did one handle the discovery that the enemy might not be quite as monstrous as previously advertised? General Techmore had faced down enemy fleets, survived assassination attempts, and once personally held a fortress against a siege that lasted 43 days. None of those experiences had prepared him for the tactical complexity of waking up two sleeping cubs without disturbing their makeshift human pillow. The decision to move Danny to the medical bay had caused what military historians would probably classify as a moderate command crisis. Commander Veltan had spent 20 minutes explaining why treating enemy prisoners beyond minimum requirements violated at least 12 military regulations. Lieutenant Brachtul had helpfully pointed out that fraternization with enemy personnel could be construed as treason. Healer Mordek had simply shrugged and noted that keeping the human alive would be considerably easier with proper medical facilities. The Cubs, naturally, had solved the entire debate by refusing to leave Danny's side. "This is unprecedented," Veltan observed, watching as Crix and Nala flanked Danny's medical bed like a pair of particularly determined bodyguards. "In 3 centuries of military service, I have never witnessed Cubs forming attachment bonds with enemy combatants." "Yes, well," the general replied dryly, "I suspect the tactical manuals failed to account for this particular scenario. Perhaps we should suggest an addendum." Chapter 15. What to do when your offspring adopt the enemy. Danny was conscious now, though clearly still fighting off the infection that had nearly killed him. Modern Vakhar medical technology was proving remarkably effective at healing human physiology, despite the obvious biological differences. The shoulder wound that had been threatening to cost him his life was now merely a source of persistent discomfort. "Feeling better?" Nala asked, perched on a chair that had been hastily adjusted to accommodate her smaller frame. She held what appeared to be a data pad containing information about human biology, which she'd been studying with the sort of academic intensity that would have made university professors proud. "Much better, thanks to you two," Danny replied, then glanced nervously at the general, who had been maintaining a silent vigil from across the medical bay. "Though I have a feeling your father and I need to have what humans call a serious conversation." "Father is curious about human behavioral patterns," Crix announced cheerfully, apparently oblivious to the undercurrents of tension in the room. "Cubs have provided extensive observational data regarding human kindness responses." The general's expression suggested he was still processing the concept of human kindness responses and finding it roughly as believable as faster-than-light travel powered by wishful thinking. "Your Cubs," Danny said carefully, "have been asking some very interesting questions about the war." Both young Vakhar perked up immediately, recognizing the opening they'd been waiting for. Nala activated her datapad with practiced efficiency, while Crix assumed what was probably his best impression of a serious military briefing posture. "Human Danny," Nala began formally, "we have conducted preliminary analysis of current conflict parameters." The general's head turned sharply toward his daughter. "You have what?" "Cubs possess unrestricted access to command briefings," Crix explained matter-of-factly. "Security protocols classify offspring as non-threatening intelligence assets. We observe, we listen, we learn." "And what, exactly, have you learned?" the general asked, his voice carrying the sort of dangerous quiet that preceded either enlightenment or summary execution. The twins exchanged glances. Then Nala cleared her throat, with the sort of nervous precision that suggested she was about to deliver information no one particularly wanted to hear. "Current war objectives center on territorial expansion and resource acquisition," she recited. "Human colonies represent strategic targets due to mineral wealth and agricultural capacity. However, analysis suggests diminishing returns on military investment versus increasing resistance effectiveness." Danny raised an eyebrow. "That's a fancy way of saying, this war is getting expensive, and humans are getting better at fighting back." "Precisely," Crix said, apparently delighted that the human had grasped the concept so quickly. Additionally, human behavioral patterns indicate strong protective responses to non-combatant populations. Military doctrine assumes enemy callousness toward civilian casualties, but observational evidence suggests opposite conclusion. The general stared at his cubs with the expression of someone who'd just realized his children had been conducting independent intelligence analysis in their spare time. "How long have you been monitoring command briefings?" "Since conflict initiation," Nala replied innocently. "Cubs require educational stimulation. Military strategy provides excellent cognitive development opportunities." "Sweet galactic core," Danny muttered. "Your kids are smarter than most of our generals." The conversation was interrupted by the sharp whine of emergency alert systems. Red lighting bathed the medical bay as the ship's defensive systems sprang to life, and the general's communication device immediately began squawking with the sort of urgent chatter that indicated someone, somewhere, was about to have a very bad day. "General Theckmore to Command Center," he barked into the device. "Report." "Sir, multiple human vessels detected on intercept course. Fleet composition suggests rescue operation focused on prisoner recovery. Estimated time to engagement, 32 minutes. The general's expression shifted from parental concern to military commander in the space of a single heartbeat. "Battle stations. Implement defensive pattern Theta 9. Prepare for—" "Father," Nala interrupted, her voice carrying a note of urgency that cut through the building chaos. "Human Danny will be targeted during rescue attempt. Standard protocol requires prisoner elimination to prevent intelligence recovery." The general paused, his strategic mind automatically confirming what his daughter had just stated. Enemy rescue operations always included provisions for preventing prisoner recapture. If the human died during the engagement, it would eliminate any intelligence value while demonstrating Vakhar resolve. Standard procedure. Logical. Efficient. And completely unacceptable to the two young Vakhar who had appointed themselves as Danny's unofficial protection detail. "You cannot allow harm to human Danny," Crix declared, with the sort of absolute certainty that only children could muster when confronting immovable adults. "He is friend-ally, protected status." Protected status? Commander Veltan had entered the medical bay, her expression suggesting she was witnessing the complete breakdown of military discipline as she'd understood it. "General, with respect, enemy prisoners do not qualify for—" The ship shuddered as the first human weapons found their range. The rescue fleet had arrived ahead of schedule, and they weren't particularly interested in polite negotiations. Danny struggled to sit up on the medical bed, his face pale but determined. "General," he said quietly, "your cubs are right about one thing. This rescue operation is going to get very messy very quickly. Standard human protocol is to eliminate enemy command personnel during prisoner recovery missions." The general's eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening my family, human?" "No, sir," Danny replied, then carefully moved to shield both cubs with his body as another weapon's impact shook the ship. "I'm trying to protect them." And there it was. The moment that would be analyzed by military academies and diplomatic corps for generations to come. A wounded human prisoner, facing rescue by his own forces, choosing to place himself between enemy fire and two alien children who had shown him nothing but kindness. The general stared at this impossible tableau. His cubs pressed against the human's sides, the enemy marine's arms wrapped protectively around them, yellow eyes meeting brown with perfect understanding. "Commander Veltan," he said finally, his voice carrying a new note of absolute authority. "Escort the human and my cubs to the secure shelter in my personal quarters. Full protective protocols." "Sir?" The Cubs have declared this human to be under their protection, the general continued, his massive frame already moving toward the exit as battle stations sounded throughout the ship. And I have never yet disappointed my children when their cause was just. As the general strode toward the command center to face the approaching human fleet, his enhanced hearing caught one last exchange from the medical bay. "Human Danny," Nala whispered, "will your people understand that you chose to protect enemy Cubs?" "Probably not at first," Danny replied softly. "But humans have this funny habit of eventually figuring out the right thing to do, even when it takes us a while to get there." The general allowed himself something that might have been a smile as he entered the command center. Perhaps there was something to be learned from the tactical wisdom of 8-year-old strategists and wounded Marines who chose compassion over survival. The human rescue fleet held position just outside weapons range, their formation speaking of professional competence and barely restrained aggression. Captain Brianna's voice crackled through the communication array, crisp and demanding. "Vakhar vessel, this is Captain Brianna of the Terran destroyer Constellation. We demand immediate release of our captured personnel." General Techmore settled into his command chair, studying the tactical display with new eyes. The humans had come for their wounded comrade with the sort of determination that spoke volumes about their species' protective instincts, much like his own response to threats against his Cubs. "Open channel," he commanded. "Captain Brianna, this is General Techmore. Your Marine is unharmed. In fact, he has proven most educational regarding human behavioral patterns." A pause. Then, "General, we're prepared to negotiate for his return." Techmore glanced at the security monitor showing his quarters, where Danny sat with Crix and Nala, all three of them drawing pictures on data pads while quietly discussing the finer points of interstellar diplomacy from a child's perspective. "Captain," he said slowly, "I believe such negotiations may prove more productive than either of us initially anticipated. After all, the most effective generals were the ones who knew when to fight, and when to find a different kind of victory altogether."